I love history. A brief history of the Middle East is something that would bode well for all of us to appreciate. Listen in to something just a few minutes long, but gives a comprehensive understanding of the history of the Middle East. On the flip side, I have things that I'd like to share that I see beyond what has been presented here, but something very valuable. Listen in.
Hamas has launched a full-scale attack on Israel, murdering over 1,000 innocent civilians in the single largest mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. This attack has outraged many nations across the world and has triggered what is likely to be the region's bloodiest conflict in over 50 years. Now, as justification for these attacks, Hamas and Hezbollah, and even some left-wing political activists in the West, have long argued that Israelis are nothing more than colonizers and settlers. And in the wake of the Hamas massacre, several academics in the US and in Europe even cheered on these killings as an act of decolonization. So this begs the question, are Israelis really colonizers that have no relevant claim or justification to have a homeland in the region? Well, in order to consider that, let's conduct a brief review of the history of the area known as the Levant. The first large-scale settlement by the Jewish people began in the Levant during the Bronze Age, roughly around the 13th century BC. This was known as the time of the Judges. This was followed by the unified Israelite kingdom under the kings Saul, David, and finally Solomon, which lasted from 1020 BC to 930 BC. The kingdom was then divided between the two Jewish kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Israel lasted till 720 BC when it was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, and Judah lasted till 586 BC when it was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. And from that time till 1948, the territory would be fought over and controlled by several empires, to include the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Romans, Byzantines, the Arab Caliphates, which started around 633 AD, the Crusader kingdoms, back to the Arabs, and then would be conquered and remain under the rule of the Ottoman Empire until its defeat in World War I. And during this entire time, there had been an unbroken population of ethnic Jews living in the area known as the Levant. In fact, the name Palestine was not the official name of the region until Roman Emperor Hadrian put down a major Jewish revolt, resorting to near total genocide of the Jewish people and then renaming the province from Judea to Palestine as an insult to the Jews. Now, let us look at the modern era. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I marked a pivotal moment in the history of the region because the Ottomans had controlled the land that now encompasses Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. Ultimately, Britain took direct control over what became known as the Mandate of Palestine and the Emirate of Transjordan in 1920, and they continued to rule these areas until 1948. But following centuries of persecution culminating in the Holocaust, it was acknowledged by many that the Jewish people needed a homeland and that the territory within the Levant made sense given both the presence of a Jewish population and the long-term historical and religious connection to the region. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a plan to partition the British territory into separate Jewish and Arab states, and that plan was accepted by the Jewish leadership, but rejected by the Arab states, leading to the First Arab-Israeli War. And since then, multiple wars have been fought in 1967, 1973, among many other smaller engagements and conflicts. And over the last 50 years, Israel has managed to normalize and improve relations with some of its historical enemies. But lasting peace and recognition of Israel's right to exist has been difficult to achieve, largely because of the emergence of terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, who have continued to wage war on Israel for decades. These groups and many Western academics have gone so far as to justify even the most heinous acts deliberately targeting civilians as justifiable in a war of decolonization. But here's the thing. Jews have been living in this region for over 3,000 years. To accuse Israel of colonization doesn't make a great deal of sense given the history. If a Jewish homeland in the Levant is colonization, wouldn't a Palestinian state be one as well? Not to mention that there are already several Arab states in the region, with most of them existing on land that was originally taken through conquest. So look, if the argument is that despite the fact there are several Arab and Muslim states in the region, that the Arab and Muslim populations of the Levant should be able to have their own state, That is an argument that many can understand, and one that Israelis have even agreed to. But if the argument is that Israel as a state has no right to exist and is nothing more than foreign conquerors, I'm sorry, but to believe that requires a lack of understanding of the history of the region, not to mention a pretty intellectually inconsistent view of conquest and colonization. But their overall argument is even worse than that. They are attempting to justify the deliberate murdering, kidnapping, and raping of innocent civilians in order to achieve a political objective. So, ask yourself this. With these sort of false justifications being used to prop up the worst of atrocities, would you want to live next to a state with a charter that not only justified, but rewarded the killing of you and your loved ones?
Well said. Very brief, important historical facts. A couple of points, though. For those extreme Muslims, this is a religious war of conquest of the entire world. They're doing it in the name of their God. One thing that we Jews need to do is to recognize that the land ultimately that we have, it's true with the judges, and you speak about the history, but the history is much longer than that. God told Abraham that this will be the land of his descendants. Then he told Isaac, it will be through him. He will be the progenitor. And ultimately, God tells Jacob that his 12 sons will be the 12 tribes of Israel, and they will be the fathers of the land of Israel. So really what it comes down to is not just merely the history of the Jewish people being there, but this is actually something that the Torah tells us very clearly, that God has given this land to the Jewish people. So that's unique because there's no other people that have a claim that a particular land was given to them by God Almighty that should be their land and to be their land eternally. Others have taken lands by conquest. Now, the truth is, Joshua did conquer the land, absolutely, from the Canaanites, but he only did that as something that was given over hundreds of years earlier, that this would be the land of the Jewish people. So I think the first argument that we need to make is one that ultimately might be difficult for Jewish people, because the G word, saying God, and that God is the one who gave us this land, and it is a holy land because God has given us this land. And therefore we have a responsibility not just to each other, but we have a responsibility ultimately to God in being on the land, maintaining the land, protecting the inhabitants of the land. We have to become comfortable with that, with the G word, with God, this is the basis of our claim. And especially Muslims, who are, many of them, religious fanatics, and base on their belief system. I think they would respect us a lot more if we believed in what our belief system is, rather than just giving historical documentation and the historical right that we have to the land, and rather than the God-given right, and not just right, but actually obligation to the land. The Muslim world will respect that a lot more. Not that they will agree with it. Don't get me wrong. They won't, because for them, this is their religious war, that they have to conquer Israel and, for that matter, conquer the rest of civilization that is not under the Muslim rule. But Israel is a great place to start. But don't be fooled. It will not be the last place. Our argument, yes, is historical, but the history goes much further and much deeper. And it's a godly history of the Jewish people that is the basis, and that is crucial for us to share with the world.